Welcome, friends! Today is the start of the 14th week of 9.1. I guess yesterday was for NA players. What we have to go over today is picking up something we have left along the way quite a few months ago. The discussion, or I guess the lamentation, the complaint, or the frustration related to tanking in Mythic Plus. This was back when the major complaint in Mythic Plus was that tanks were essentially little pussies, constantly running away, being afraid of more than 3 enemies, and being forced to run around because they couldn't just take a beating like they should, right? They are tanks, they are supposed to take a beating. That was the main complaint. There was a kiting meta in the game. This was carried over in good part from BFA. So we entered Shadowlands, and the main issue is that the way players started dealing with the Mythic Plus keys becoming higher and higher in difficulty was that I am a tank, I am going to jump in the pack, I am going to use my cooldowns, and then once the cooldowns are over, I am way too squishy. I am way too fragile to just stay there and take a beating, so instead I have to run away. I got my aggro on the enemies, they're gonna follow me, so I don't risk that. I can just leave and let the group finish them off. This was further exacerbated by a list of affixes that basically wanted you to do that, like necrotic, like raging, even things like bolstering made it favorable to do. In some cases, even sanguine, you kind of want to kite away. So on top of the damage, on top of the enemy damage the tank was taking, you also had some affixes which were making this style of tanking very, very popular. Now, what happened with tanking this way, with this kiting way of tanking? Well, what happens is that not all tanks are the same, and they don't all function in the same way, which means, eventually, certain tanks are going to be more suited for this style than compared to others. Being able to jump in and out pretty quickly every single pack is a pretty useful tool when you want to be into this kiting meta. Having short cooldowns that allow you to use them every time you join and fight a new pack is also very wanted if you wanted to go for this kiting meta. This, of course, started a pretty clear segregation amongst the tanks. You had tanks that were able to follow this style with their tools, and then you had tanks that were not able. So you had tanks like Brewmaster Monk and, more importantly, like Vengeance Demon Hunter, which were very well suited for this style. A Demon Hunter could leap in with Infernal Strike, use Fell Devastation. Fell Devastation turns them, gives them 8 seconds before the nerf, 8 seconds of Metamorphosis, which makes them pretty tanky. They have a 1-minute cooldown on things like Elysian Decree. They have also very short cooldowns on things like Fiery Brand. So this allowed them to keep up the pack, the Mythic Plus pack, for 10 seconds, sometimes 15 seconds before things get hairy, in which case it's time to leap away. That's why Vengeance over time became the overwhelmingly favored tank to play in Mythic Plus. I mentioned also Brewmaster because it remained also a decent tank to use in Mythic Plus because it had similar tools. Brewmaster was very, very mobile. They also had the ability to jump in and out of the packs. They could sort of cycle through all of their brew charges every pack and then run away, let the brews recharge so that when you have to pull another pack, all of the brew charges are going to be back up. So they were doing pretty well. Then, of course, you had tanks like a Blood Death Knight. You had also tanks like a Prot Paladin and even tanks like Guardian Druid. At the start, these type of tanks did not have a very nice way to deal with the kiting meta. They didn't have particularly short cooldowns to use every pull, or they didn't have particularly good mobility to allow them this kiting style. So over time, we started with this kiting meta at the start of Shadowlands, but over time, Blizzard has done some changes, which is ultimately why we are here, talking about how the tanking has evolved up to this point, how things are doing within tanks in Mythic Plus up to this point. You might have noticed in the last few weeks, whenever we go over Mythic Plus, I have been pretty positive and pretty grateful towards the balancing and the meta that is in tanks. We even had, for a brief moment, every single tank represented in the highest keys completed in Mythic Plus. Sure, it didn't last a lot, but even now we have much more variety than we used to have months ago, because now you have seen Protection Paladins being very high in keys. We have seen Guardian Druids for quite a while in this new patch 9.1. We still see, just plenty of Vengeance Demon Hunters and even Brewmaster Monk. The only ones that are still on the low end are Blood DKs and Protection Warriors, but the diversity has increased a lot, which begs the question, what about this whole kiting meta? Between the start of the expansion and where we are now, Blizzard has buffed tanks, either by buffing them or by nerfing the damage taken in the keys. So all of the tanks, for example, have received a buff that makes them take 10% less damage overall, just 5% for Vengeance Demon Hunters because they had the bug which they benefited from, and then they also had the change which made all the enemies in Mythic Plus deal 10% less damage with their auto attacks, which is also very good for a tank. And also a very good change, particularly for the whole kiting situation, right? If the main issue is that you get smacked too hard by 10 enemies pulled all together, the melee auto attack, which is going to be the main source of damage taken for a tank, is going to be nearly 70%, sometimes over 70% of the entirety of the damage taken. That's a pretty good change. Blizzard also went on with the start of 9.1 trying to nerf some of the main affixes that were a problem, particularly for tanks. They nerfed the damage increase of raging mobs, for example. It went from 100% to 75%, and then we know that in 9.1.5, this 75% is going to be nerfed down to 50%. They nerfed Necrotic. Now the elite, the lieutenant mobs in Mythic Plus keys are going to apply Necrotic at a 50% reduced rate, which is going to allow the tank to stay in the pack for longer before having to run away. We even had some nerfs like bolstering, meaning it's not as punishing to bolster enemies compared to before. So we have gotten this series of changes centered around tanks. I'm sure, DPS and healers benefited from these changes in some way, but clearly these were more important when it comes to tanks. So if before we had this issue, this annoying issue that kiting was the main problem, that it, first of all, to many people, kiting wasn't enjoyable. Yes, we went over this already. Some people still enjoy the idea of kiting. They enjoy the strategy of, I have to get in, use whatever cooldowns I can in this small frame, in this small period, and then run out. Some people still like it. However, there were quite a few people, specifically tank players, that didn't really enjoy this, especially if your class and your spec wasn't really, it wasn't really feeling like they should do something like this. Someone could say, well, a Vengeance Demon Hunter kind of fits this theme of being very mobile, jumping in and out, being able to dodge, bob and weave between hits, but then you have a Guardian Druid, a giant bear, or a Blood DK, a spec which is unique for how immobile it is, for how slow it moves. If you make a tank with that type of flavor, with that type of style, then the whole kiting thing is completely out of place. If I am a Blood DK, I should be able to just stand there, plant my feet, and take the damage, not force this type of kiting strategy on every single tank. That was kind of the issue back then. So the question that we have nowadays is, has this thing changed? Have we actually gotten rid of this, intrusive strategy like kiting, like the kiting style for tanks? Well, the actual answer, you can have it yourself, because if you have been part of Mythic Plus keys recently, and by recently I mean the past few months, you will have noticed yourself as well that the amount of kiting that the tanks are doing has significantly reduced compared to Castelnatria tier, anywhere from November to March or April or even May. Since then, the amount of kiting that we are having in keys has gotten much, much smaller. Back then, pretty much the only situations in which you didn't see tank kiting was during the Prideful periods. As soon as you get Prideful, unless you weren't taking it to kill a boss, but to kill a trash pack, the tanks were pretty safe. With the Prideful buff, they were able to not kite as much, but outside of that, the kiting was prevalent almost everywhere. Whereas now, we have gotten the buffs to tanks for their damage resistance, we have gotten the nerfs to the enemies to do less damage to the tanks, and now we have a different affix, Tormented, which is also going to help the tanks. Some picks are even helping you with what you were trying to do before, or rather to not make you do what you were doing before in this kiting meta, things that are very popular for tanks, for tank powers in Mythic Plus, like the Crumbling Bulwark. Giving you 5% versatility, for example, it's already 2.5% less damage taken, but also Upon entering combat, your damage taken is reduced by 40% for 4 seconds. This helps you a lot as soon as you enter a pack, not requiring that whole style of use your CDs, once the CDs are out you can run away. Now with this power you already have basically 4 seconds extra that you can stay there with a very powerful damage reduction tool. Even the Stone Ward, which is a power used by non-tanks as well, the 20% max HP shield is very powerful on tanks. Not just because they have more HP, but also because they have more defensives, they have more resistances, so it's gonna be harder to break that shield on a tank, which gives them more defensiveness, allows them to stay in the pack for longer. So on the long run, these powers are going to help you more, compared to Prideful, in being able to stay in the packs for longer, not having to resort to this whole kiting deal as opposed to the first season of Mythic Plus. This might also be the reason why we are now seeing way more tanks being playable. Back in Season 1, it was just a Vengeance Demon Hunter Fiesta. Other than that, it was very hard to find other tanks, whereas now it's much more varied. You might have noticed this yourself, even if you're not a tank, since you aren't gonna see any other tanks in your key if you're a tank yourself. But even if you're a healer or a DPS, I'm sure you have played plenty of keys with Guardian Druids, with Brewmaster Monks, with Prot Paladins, with Blood DKs even, so right now, the situation has gotten much more varied and much more available to all the other tanks. So I wanted to reflect on this for today and for the change that has been brought over for tanks. So I wanted to take a look at this to see how you feel about this. Whether or not you are a tank, to see from your own perspective how much you were kiting and how much you were running away, how much you were afraid of the damage you were taking back in Season 1 compared to now, to see from your perspective how things have changed, or maybe whether you are a healer or a DPS, and to see how the keys have changed from your perspective with this reduced amount of kiting required in keys compared to before. As I said, there are going to be a few people who enjoyed the kiting, who enjoyed the style, so maybe we can see their perspective as well. Why was it a good style according to them? In my opinion, I'm pretty happy with this, not even just because of the style itself, but simply because it allows more room and more windows for multiple tank specs to be in a key. And for myself, as a healer most of the time in a key is also just more enjoyable. Finding and having to deal with different types of tanks in keys is more refreshing than having to enter a key and knowing that in 90% of the situations you will be with a Vengeance tank. Nowadays it's much more diverse, so it keeps things more fresh and more varied for me as well. So I'm all for it. I'm all for this change. Let me guys know, as usual, what you think about this and about this shift from a less kiting intensive meta in Mythic Plus when it comes to tanks. For the moment, we can stop here. Thank you guys for watching. If you have enjoyed the content, leave a like on the video, subscribe as well to the channel if you feel like. Now, we can stop. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, there's a very important debate that needs to be settled. Cherries or strawberries?